Hello, today we are continuing our conversation on synaptic communication between neurons. Specifically, we'll be discussing postsynaptic potentials, namely the changes in postsynaptic neuron membrane potential. Specifically, our learning outcomes for this section include describing postsynaptic potentials and their effects at the postsynaptic membrane, and differentiating between EPSP, IPSP cancellation, temporal summation, and spatial summation. So let's review for a moment some of the action that is happening at our synapse. We have a presynaptic neuron with dendrites, a cell body, an axon, and an axon terminal. And let's say that this is an axodendritic synapse. So here is the postsynaptic neuron with dendrites, a cell body, and its own axon. The space between the axon of the presynaptic neuron and the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron is called the synaptic cleft. When the presynaptic neuron fires an action potential, that action potential propagates or travels down the axon to the axon terminal. There, it causes the opening of voltage-gated calcium channels. Calcium rushes into the cell from high concentration outside the cell to low concentration inside the cell. Calcium binds to a sensor protein called synaptotagmin, and together the calcium synaptotagmin complex travel toward the synaptic vesicles, which are filled with neurotransmitters. And then the calcium synaptotagmin complex interacts with a complex of proteins called SNARE. This interaction then allows the synaptic vesicles to dock, fuse, and exocytose their contents of neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitter travels across the synaptic cleft and binds to special receptors on the postsynaptic dendrites, and ultimately affects the membrane potential of the postsynaptic neuron. Changes in the postsynaptic neuron's membrane potential in response to a neurotransmitter is called the postsynaptic potential. There are two main types of postsynaptic potentials: excitatory postsynaptic potentials and inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. These are really just glorified graded potentials, glorified depolarizations and glorified hyperpolarizations. They're glorified in that they are simply depolarizations and hyperpolarizations that are specific for the postsynaptic neuron. Excitatory postsynaptic potentials, also called EPSPs, result from neurotransmitters binding to excitatory receptors on the postsynaptic membrane, which ultimately allow anions to leave or cations to enter the postsynaptic cell, thereby making the inside of the postsynaptic neuron more positive and depolarizing the cell. This depolarization makes the postsynaptic membrane potential closer to threshold and increases the likelihood that the postsynaptic neuron will fire an action potential. Inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, also called IPSPs, result from neurotransmitters binding to inhibitory receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, which ultimately allow anions to enter the postsynaptic neuron or cations to leave the postsynaptic neuron, thereby making the inside of the postsynaptic neuron more negative. This, in turn, hyperpolarizes the postsynaptic neuron, taking it further from threshold and decreasing the likelihood that the postsynaptic neuron will fire an action potential. Our multipolar neurons have functional specialization in different regions, meaning different parts of the neuron is specialized for different functions. For instance, at our dendrites and soma, there are many chemically gated, also known as ligand-gated channels. Our axons, on the other hand, have primarily voltage-gated channels. Now, integration of our EPSPs and iPSPs occur in the dendrites and cell body of the neurons and get summated at the axon hillock. If, after summation, taking into account the EPSPs and iPSPs, if, after summation, the postsynaptic neuron reaches threshold, a new action potential is fired and is propagated down the axon of the postsynaptic neuron. So let's think about this. Our brains are capable of integrating and processing countless stimuli and inputs all at once. We may simultaneously be thinking about what we want to have for dinner, what we want to be when we grow up, what direction we want to go in life, how much work we have to do to get to that point in life. Maybe we're hearing the sound of a dog barking or taking in various visual stimuli while simultaneously wishing we were sprawled out in the grass watching the clouds go by. Our brains, miraculous creations that they are, can process all of that, filtering out what's not important and paying attention to what is. But how does this happen? Well, let's create a very hypothetical example. Let's say we are in yoga class and we are in tree pose and we're trying to balance, not to fall out of the posture. Now, within our brain, in this very hypothetical example, is a neuron that we'll call a wobble neuron, shown here. The wobble neuron is the postsynaptic neuron, and synapsing on it are a variety of other presynaptic neurons. Now, some of the presynaptic neurons have neurotransmitters that will create excitatory postsynaptic potentials in the postsynaptic neuron, such as these presynaptic neurons here and here and here. And some of the presynaptic neurons have neurotransmitters that will create inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, or IPSPs, in the postsynaptic neuron, such as this presynaptic neuron here. The EPSPs and the iPSPs that are created, in turn, have to be summated to see what the ultimate effect is on the postsynaptic wobble neuron. If the postsynaptic neuron reaches threshold and fires an action potential, we wobble and fall out of our tree pose. So let's check out some possible summation types and outcomes. So here is our wobble neuron, and it has excitatory presynaptic neuron number 1 interacting with it. When this neuron fires an action potential and releases its neurotransmitter, it creates an excitatory postsynaptic potential, an EPSP, in the postsynaptic wobble neuron. But this one EPSP is not enough for the wobble neuron to reach threshold, so no action potential is fired, and we do not wobble. If, though, our excitatory presynaptic neuron number 1 fires an action potential, releases its neurotransmitter, and creates an EPSP in the postsynaptic wobble neuron, and then very quickly our excitatory presynaptic neuron number 1 fires another action potential and releases more neurotransmitter, creating another EPSP, the two EPSPs can be added together. When added together, it is enough for the postsynaptic wobble neuron to reach threshold and an action potential fires. And, unfortunately, we wobble. This type of summation is called temporal summation because two EPSPs from one neuron come close enough together in time, temporal time, for the postsynaptic neuron to reach threshold and subsequently fires an action potential. Now, additionally, we can have spatial summation. In this scenario, we're still dealing with our postsynaptic wobble neuron and our excitatory presynaptic neuron number 1. Now, though, let's add in excitatory presynaptic neuron number 2. Let's say that the excitatory presynaptic neuron number 1 fires an action potential and releases its neurotransmitter that causes an EPSP in the wobble neuron, but not enough of an EPSP for the wobble neuron to reach threshold. The wobble neuron then returns back to its resting membrane potential. Then, let's say, excitatory presynaptic neuron number 2 fires an action potential and releases its neurotransmitter that causes an EPSP in the wobble neuron. But again, not enough of an EPSP for the wobble neuron to reach threshold. The wobble neuron returns back to its resting membrane potential. But then, let's say that the excitatory presynaptic neurons 1 and 2 fire an action potential at the same time and both cause EPSPs in the wobble neuron. And the two EPSPs, when added together, are enough for the wobble neuron to reach threshold. The wobble neuron then fires an action potential and we wobble. Again, this is called spatial summation because the two EPSPs are coming from different neurons that occupy different space. And finally, we can have EPSP, IPSP cancellation. In this situation, we're still dealing with our postsynaptic wobble neuron and our excitatory presynaptic neuron number 1. Now, though, let's add an inhibitory presynaptic neuron, a neuron whose neurotransmitter creates an IPSP in the postsynaptic wobble neuron. If the excitatory presynaptic neuron number 1 fires an action potential and releases neurotransmitter, it creates an EPSP in the wobble neuron, but still not enough depolarization to reach threshold. If the inhibitory presynaptic neuron fires an action potential, it causes hyperpolarization, an IPSP in the wobble neuron, taking it further from threshold. And if both neurons, the excitatory presynaptic neuron number 1 and the inhibitory presynaptic neuron, if both of these neurons fire at the same time, their EPSPs and IPSPs cancel out, and the wobble neuron does not fire. And happily, we do not wobble out of our tree pose. So to summarize, we have two main types of postsynaptic potentials: excitatory postsynaptic potentials and inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. Our inhibitory postsynaptic potentials are graded hyperpolarizations that take our neurons further from threshold. Our excitatory postsynaptic potentials, our EPSPs, are graded depolarizations. They occur in the dendrites and cell bodies. They're smaller than our action potentials. Their sizes vary. They're graded, and they summate and get us closer to our threshold. Now, whatever is happening at our postsynaptic membrane, whether it's receiving EPSPs or IPSPs, these changes in membrane potential spread to the axon hillock, where they are summated, and if we reach thresholds, we fire an action potential. Now, action potentials, contrary to our postsynaptic potentials, action potentials are large. They're the same size, the same amplitude or magnitude. They fire once we reach threshold, and they are all or none, and they lack summation. So that brings us to the end of this section. We should now be able to describe postsynaptic potentials and their effect at the postsynaptic membrane. We should also be able to differentiate between EPSP, IPSP cancellation, temporal summation, and spatial summation. Until next time, thank you so much. Have a beautiful day.